Hello, and welcome to the University of Utah Press's podcast. I'm Hannah New, and with me today is James Swensen, author of In a Rugged Land, Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, and the Three Mormon Towns Collaborative, 1953 to 1954, which is an in-depth exploration of a forgotten work by the two of the 20th century's most important photographers. James R. Swensen is an associate professor of art history and the history of photography at Brigham Young University. He is the recipient of the 2016-2019 Butler Young Scholar Award from the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. So thank you very much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. We're really happy to have you. So I'm going to dive right in, and I would like to talk about when did this collaborative project first come to your attention? What drew you to it? Why this project?
I've actually been working with this for quite a while. I did my master's degree. For my master's thesis, I wrote on Dorothea Lange in Utah. And during that project, I had the opportunity to meet Daniel Dixon, who was her son, who actually was on tour giving a couple of lectures in Utah. And so after one of the events, and this would have been about 2001, I think, I went up and asked him if I could correspond with her, I could call him or find out more about this collaboration. I had always been interested in history of photography, and particularly the photography of Utah, and so this collaboration I had known about. I had also done some archival work at Oakland Museum of Art, which has the archives for Dorothea Lange, and so I had seen some of the negatives and things that hadn't been printed as part of my master's thesis. So when I asked Daniel if I could correspond with him, he was he was wonderfully kind of grumpy but very nice and obliging. And so I started a correspondence with him, and I asked him all my questions, and I would receive these beautiful letters with his father's the Thunderbird seal on top, and I still have those letters, and that's how it kind of started. Later on, when I was working on my PhD at the University of Arizona, I had the opportunity to work in the Ansel Adams archives. And so at that point, I was working on other projects in my dissertation, which is on a totally different topic, but I've always been nesting away and collecting information on this. And finally, I had an opportunity about 2009, 2010 to start writing it and to start interviewing people who were in the photographs or from Gunlock and Tokerville in particular. And so again, just bits and pieces, and then finally was able to get it together and finish it a couple of years ago.
And just to specify, the three Mormon towns is Gunlock, Tokerville, and
correct.
St. George,
correct? Exactly. Yeah. So this collaboration, primarily the small town of Gunlock, Tokerville, and St. George. They worked in the whole area, and there's some photographs in the collaboration from Rockville, some from Zion National Park, but that was the center of their investigation.
Out of curiosity, I've never been to Gunlock or Tokerville. How are they today?
Well, you might have actually driven. Have you been to Zion National Park?
No.
Oh, okay. Then you've got a whole bunch of things you need to do.
I do.
So Tokerville, then and now, has always been one of these gateways to Zion National Park. In fact, if you're going there straight, if you're traveling south on I-15, you'll still travel right through down the main street of Tokerville. Tokerville, if you look at the photographs, it's remarkably similar. Many of the same buildings are there. As they kind of predicted, it's become more of a bedroom community. I know people who live in Tokerville but work in St. George, and so it's not as tied to the land as it once was. But, for example, a couple of the people, in fact, the old Paul Negley, the newspaper boy who's in the book, he still lives there. The day I met him, he was managing the water irrigation system, if I remember, for the graveyard. So it still has this size. Gunlock is a little quieter, a little sleepier than it appears in the photographs. You're not going to find kids on horseback riding through it.
Darn.
But the old church is there, and it's now become the kind of the city hall. It's lost its steeple. Many of the old buildings are there, but a couple of times I've been there, mostly in the summer, it's been quiet.
Interesting. So you really did your research for this book. You interviewed people who were in these photographs, and so can you talk about some of the research you did behind the scenes of this book?
Sure. I once I started to get into it, again, started with interviewing Daniel Dixon through correspondence. I've always just loved talking to people and getting their insight. I had all the archival work and correspondence with Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams and their friends like Nancy Newhall. So I had that side pretty well covered. But I wanted to find some of the people in the photographs. And luckily, part of my research was also helped by a couple of friends who were also working on this. Diana Turnbow in particular had put together the great exhibition that was at BYU a few years ago. And she had met a couple of the people in the photographs. There were others that I reached out to and did a couple interviews, emailed a whole bunch of people, tried to find out who the people were in the photographs as best I could. And actually, that was turned out to be one of my favorite parts.
Oh, that's awesome. So did you hear any quirky stories while you were doing research that you didn't put in the book?
I tried to put most of the quirky stories in.
Great.
I wanted to personalize it, and especially, these stories from, what were once the kids in 1953 that are now adults. They remember Ansel Adams. They remember, his distinctive station wagon with the platform on top pulling into town and being chock-a-block with photographic equipment. One of my favorite stories that I believe I put in, but there's not the photograph. There's one photograph of the inside of the kitchen of the Bishop of Gunlock, who was a man by the name of Toby Hunt. And it shows his wife there canning beans, green beans. It was green. They were canning green beans this season. And one of the daughters is down on the ground reading a comic book. And according to the sister, Mary, Ansel Adams wanted her to put the comic book away because he felt that it wasn't, didn't have the same kind of romantic pioneering aspect. Here you have a kid, in one of these pioneer towns reading a comic book, which seemed out of place for him. But she defied him and did it anyway. Awesome. And he appears, and you can see it in the negative, right? She's there reading the comic book, and I just really love that detail. And it didn't surprise me that Ansel Adams wanted her to put it away, nor did it surprise me that she didn't put it away.
That's a great story. So you mentioned that Lange's interest shifted from capturing grander pictures to capturing community and people's interactions. So was this a shift across photography at the time in general? And what do you think caused that shift? Yeah,
so Lange actually makes a comment that during the Great Depression, in fact, what we remember Lange most for is her big sweeping project of covering migration. In fact, she terms it an exodus, that it becomes this big event, almost biblical in proportion. And so after the Great Depression, she suffers from about a decade of physical elements that really hampered her ability to work. And when she finally had the strength enough to come back about 1950, 1951, she says, look, I want to focus on more intimate stories, not these big panoramas and these big kind of larger human stories, but focus more on the intimate, on the kind of more personal side. Lange writes about that and encourages others to. And yes, I think you do see it with others, and it's probably most famously manifested through Edward Steichen organizes the Family of Man exhibit, and actually he's good friends with Lange, so they're kind of talking about these ideas at the same time. And Family of Man is that personalizing of the human experience, and especially after the tumult and devastation of World War II, returning to this idea that we are all part of a larger family, and in fact it's the intimate stories that connect us, that we all as human beings have this kind of shared experience. So I think with Family of Man, and there's other manifestations, right, but I think there is this larger kind of collective idea of returning to more human stories, more human subjects, and as a way of trying to figure out how to move forward in this world that they were trying to put back together.
Which leads into a different question, which so you talk in the beginning about Lange and Adams were drawn to these communities for their simplicity of living on the frontier. And how do you think the deeply entrenched American pastoral ideal, the destruction from the war, and the increasing industrialization affected how Lange and Adams represented their subjects and why they chose them?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, in fact, I think we still do this. I think we're nostalgic for this past, right? We're nostalgic for a simpler time. Lange and her husband, Paul Taylor, who was a professor at Berkeley, were very, especially coming out of the Great Depression, were interested in this idea of pioneering and the notion of self-reliance and cooperation, that these virtues were seemingly disappearing. And they saw that in California. They saw that in Oakland, which Lange even comments during her time in Utah that, it used to be a hometown, right? Oakland, the place she knew, the place she'd spent much of her life. She was born back east, but the place she spent much of her life was losing some of those virtues, those kind of small town virtues. And so I think they and others were very interested in finding places where you could still see, still experience that kind of that small town with those virtues I talked about, the people working together, being self-reliant, and specifically tied to the land. That's in many ways why I think there's focus on St. George is interesting, because they see St. George and truly talk about St. George as slipping away, as transforming, that it's becoming a highway town, that's losing some of these virtues, right? They're still visible if you look for them, but that it was in this moment of transition to becoming really just kind of another dot on the map, well, on the main highway, a main thoroughfare for Zion National Park, and for thoroughfare between California, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake. So they see that. In fact, you really present that as a place in transition. Yeah. And so the pastoral idea, right, is clearly visible in the smaller towns, right? They love photographing the fields and fruits of Tokerville. They love showing the citizens of Gunlock, bringing in their hay and working and playing in the irrigation ditches and canning and all the things that are, again, that whole idea of being attached to the land in a better, simpler time. But the war, I think, does change things, and increasingly, even places like Gunlock and Tokerville, were being brought into this larger whole. And so I think this idea of capturing it before it's gone was part of the motivation for this whole project.
It seemed to have really captured Lange. She kept coming back, right? She was there in the 30s, correct?
True, yeah. Yeah, Lange was the driving force of this project. I mean, she had done a lot of research. She knew all about the communities. She had friends, that sociologists in particular, who had worked in the area. Edward Banfield was a good friend of theirs. And Banfield had spent a whole year in Gunlock doing a sociological study for the University of Chicago. So they had all this material and all these contacts. And again, it was not a surprise by any means they ended up in these places, because they had really, they came, there's a pretext to this. They came in expecting to see things, hoping to see things, and then capturing what they could.
You did mention that there was some trouble with the authorities. How did that come in? Because it seems like the townspeople were really excited about it.
Yeah, so the collaboration does run into some challenges. Lange in particular knows that in order to work in these small towns, they need to get approval from the Church of Jesus, from the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ. And so they stop by Salt Lake City on their way down and meet with J. Reuben Clark, who was then in the First Presidency. And it seems to go well. They seem to get permission. But when they get down to southern Utah, they realize that every community is different, that the bishop in Tokerville, Toby Hunt, was very suspicious, as many small towners, I think, rightfully are, of these foreigners, basically outsiders coming in with cameras. And so he actually especially at first, denies access to a lot of things they want to photograph. Eventually it's smoothed over and they're able to photograph what they want to in Gunlock. In contrast, though, is the bishop over in Tokerville, Bishop Fish, who says, photograph anything you want, right? And so they realize that yes, they need to get permission from up on top, from the authorities, but those local authorities were just really just kind of doing the best they could with what they had, and some were more open, some were not, and so they navigated each of the places that they photographed.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. They would run into problems after, when they realized that they'd actually been telling people that the photographs were going to be in an exhibit and not in Life magazine, which was a problem because Life magazine would be seen by millions every week. And so some of these people, especially in Tokerville, got upset because, they were appearing in Life magazine. They were told they were going to appear in Life magazine, and yet here they were being seen, and not always in their best light by people all around the United States. So yeah, there's trouble and kind of little dynamics from one place to the next.
Yeah, I heard you mention about the woman who sought restitution.
Yeah, so that's part of this. She's in Tokerville. In fact, if you look at the life story, Veera Beatty is shown. She was photographed many times by Lange and Adams when they were there, but the one they selected was her sitting in front of her home, right? So the old brick behind her. She's wearing her canning apron. She's disheveled, right? It's not the way you'd want to appear to millions of people out there, and Beatty gets rather upset and actually writes Life magazine a letter, which they forward to Lange and to Taylor. And it's a rather caustic letter. In fact, she wants $1,000 because she assumes that they're making all this money and that she deserves her cut. But it's, nothing really becomes of it. Although there was animosity in Tokerville. And it lingers, right? It lingered for quite a long time.
Oh, wow. Speaking of the Life, it sounded like Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange were expecting way more photographs in the spread than what actually appeared.
Yeah.
So how did they respond to Life magazine? Time magazine.
So what happens is, they're coming in as artists. They have these high hopes. They believed that the work that they had done in Southern Utah was some of the best work they had done during their careers. And they're very heady about the whole project. But working for Life magazine was different. It was editors were the most important people. They were the ones who determined, right, what photographers did, what photographs were included in. And so when they come in kind of into conflict with the system, they realize that their aspirations in this big grandiose project is going to be cut down and condensed and really chopped down. And obviously that makes them upset. Ansel's always going to be upset because the quality of the images is not up to his standards, but few images probably are. And so there was a lot for them that they didn't like. But at the same time, that's what working for Life magazine was. I'm sure they deep down resented it, but realized that that's the game you have to play.
Yeah, absolutely. So why do you think America and these two photographers were fascinated about the West and the frontier? It seems like a subject a lot of people repeatedly turn to. Examples are John Muir, Wild West movies, especially in American art. So why do you think there's this fascination with the American West?
I think there's a lot of reasons to be fascinated with the West. Especially, obviously coming out of the 19th century and this whole idea of the formation of the myths of the cowboy and the frontier and this place where it was still rugged and you could come and you could kind of test your mettle and you could have adventure and experiences, right, that were so foreign to most people's lives. If I'm living in Boston and I see, images of cowboys and Native Americans and these things, it's just that untapped adventure, right, that I think continues to draw us. And added to that is the spectacle of landscapes like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. And even just the notion of open spaces. I think in many ways, I grew up in Salt Lake City, so I take it for granted. But when I talk to my friends back east, I get a sense of what it is about this place that still inspires this kind of romantic awe where, you can just get up in the canyons in a couple of minutes and you can have these experiences that you can't have in other places in the United States in particular. And so it's always going to be a draw and a lure for us, I think. And especially, for Ansel Adams, he knew the sublime landscapes of the West almost as well as anybody and presents them. And I think that's also part of it. How imagery plays a role in the pull we have to these places. I guarantee there's someone in Yosemite trying to stand at the exact same spot as Ansel Adams at this very moment, trying to make an Ansel Adams-like image because of that pull that these places and these images still have for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So both of these artists really believed in the project they were doing. So why did this project not get as much recognition even today as maybe it should?
Well, I think in part, this era, this kind of period for both photographers is not their best known. Obviously with Dorothea Lange, we typically think about her with the Great Depression. That's where, and rightfully so, the work she does during the Depression is brilliant. Right. Ansel Adams, this kind of longer career, but always tied to landscape, even though it bugged him that he was always typecast as a landscape photographer. But he has this kind of mid-career kind of lull right about that moment too. So I think in terms of their greater careers, it's that kind of dip for both of them. I think the other part is Dorothea Lange embraced the project. The images from the work she did in Southern Utah actually continue to be used in other exhibits. In fact, even her retrospective that took place right before she died in 1965. Ansel Adams kind of puts it behind him. Rarely do you see images of you don't see images of the series popping up in any of his monographs. And part of that, too, is because many of the negatives, I argue, actually end up in Oakland and don't go into his archives down in Tucson. So he didn't really have much to draw from. And I think the fact that it ended so poorly, where there was animosity between these two old friends, that kind of soured the whole thing, especially for Adams. I don't think he particularly enjoyed, he didn't enjoy, it seems like, talking about the project or revisiting it, even though at the time he said the work was great. And but I think that's part of it too. And working for Dorothea Lange, I think would have been tough. She was beleaguered by health issues, but she was driven to see this project through. It became her project. And I think in many ways that rubbed Ansel Adams the wrong way.
Interesting. So
I think all those dynamics, there was just a lot that kind of left this whole project more on a sour note.
Well, I don't want to end on a sour note, so do you mind telling us another maybe quirky story about the whole project that you have?
Another quirky story, yeah. I don't know if I have another quirky story, but maybe I can share one of my favorite photographs. How about that?
Yeah, I would like that. Yeah.
So there's one series in the book where, as I mentioned before, Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange pull into Gunlock. The kids know that these photographers are there, and so they start bringing out their horses and start performing for the photographers. And there's a whole series of them. The cover is one of those. The cover image is one of those where, the photographers clearly loved photographing these young children on top of their horses, climbing on their horses. And there's I could look at these images 1,000 times over and not get sick of them. There's just something fresh and playful about them. The photographs are, perfectly planned and cut off, and they're some of my favorite photographs. Just overall, and there's an element of chance. There's an element of just waiting and seeing what happens that you see in them. And that's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to photography. This whole idea that you just don't know what's going to happen. But if you're in the right place at the right time and you're patient and you have a good eye, you can capture something really great and make a seemingly just mundane moment into something that is going to be a beautiful thing to look at for many years to come.
Oh, absolutely. The cover photograph's one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's great. And so
I think there's 5 kids on that horse.
Yeah, you can actually, one of the legs is cut off, right? She was up front. But, when I was talking to Mary about this, it was the bishop's daughter, she looked at us and she's like, you know what? We were definitely performing. we would have never worn shoes on a Sunday evening in summer. They were there in August. And so, I mean, they wore makeup, they got everything ready. And so that performative element to this, right? I mean, it's really a collaboration between these kids and these kind of older photographers in their mid-careers that I think is really one of the highlights for me of the book.
I know our production manager, who was the cover designer, she had such a hard time picking the cover images. There's so many good ones.
Yeah.
And I was making a poster for the cover of the book for State Historical Society, and I accidentally sent the printers all of her cover designs that she was picking from. So we actually had different renditions of the cover in the office, and each one's just beautiful.
Yeah, it's that's another element of this book that I'm truly glad to see. Many of these photographs have never been printed before. Oakland's museum in California has all the negatives, and so I requested and actually had printed a number of images that have never been seen, that don't exist as prints, so they'd never shown up in an exhibition or in any book before. So so there's a number of them in here. In fact, I brought a lot of images for this book, and again, a lot of them have not been ever seen before. So
it's a great book. Thank you for writing it.
Well, it's my pleasure. In fact, as I was thinking about this interview, I just needed to present the photographs and get out of the way, right? They really are great images, and so it was easy to work with such good material.
Well, I also enjoyed reading your commentary. I thought it was very insightful.
Oh, good. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I would like to correct myself. I think I interchanged Life and Time magazine, and it was Life.
It was Life magazine.
Okay, I just wanted to correct myself.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. This has been James Swensen and Hannah New with the University of Utah Press.
Thank you, Hannah.